Hello and welcome to Sides of Thoughts, conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick and I'll be the producer for the show. The things that you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Sides of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio. They are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So thank you for listening to this, either live or in archive. Our subject for tonight is the contemporary state of Israel, questions of the immediate policies driving it, and hope to also have a discussion of some of the larger structures and questions about what sort of determines state in terms of with Israeli and Palestinian populations beyond the headlines and beyond sort of in parts of the more recent attacks in Gaza. So I'm joined tonight by Michael Peled and Rui Peled, who are respectively emissaries from Israel for Michael is for the Hillel at UW-Milwaukee, and Rui is the emissary for the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. So, as I think many people checking this might be sort of aware, I mean they've been more anyway. So thanks both of you for coming in and joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Now your mics are actually on, so it should be able to hear that better. Sorry for that. But in case, I mean, Israel's been in the news of late with both the bombings into Gaza, which I believe latest estimates were over 130 civilians killed, and more recently the degree of larger controversy over the UN recognition of Palestine as in terms of non-voting member state, and also then the Netanyahu's announcement of expansion of settlements, which have seen a further degree of controversy. So I mean, in part, I guess would like in terms of viewpoints. I mean, in terms of interpretations, etc. of it, as to what is happening with Israel now and what should be.
Okay, well, we'll start. I just want to say that both Roy and myself, we're not diplomatics, we're not politicians, we're not official representative of the State of Israel. So also what we represent is our own opinions. We're part of an organization called the Jewish Agency for Israel and the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. So it's just important for me to say that. But I want to start with the way you presented the things about the current events in Israel, because you said one of the things you said was the recent attacks on Gaza. And I just want to say that usually this is the way it is presented in the media, but nobody even considers the other side, that as being attacks from Gaza on Israel for the past 12 years. More than 15,000 rockets has been shoot down on Israel and on not just the southern Israel, but also Tel Aviv and the rest of the areas. More than 4.5 million Israeli civilians are under fire for the past 12 years. So this is also one side of perspective to look at things.
I mean, in general, I think that, we will be the first one to say that what we have in Israel, it's a very complex situation. Again, looking back at history and how that evolved to be as it is, and also the way it is now. You need two for tango when it comes to what's happening now. I think that both Michal and myself would really, at the end of the day, and I'm guessing I'm not just speaking for ourselves, but speaking for most of the people in both the Palestinian Authority and in Israel, want to live in peace and quiet, and want to wake up in the morning, make a living, and be able to support our families and our friends, and at the same time, live in peace and quiet. And the situation that we're in at this moment is one that, on one hand, you have the Palestinian who doesn't, at least in Gaza. The Hamas doesn't recognize Israel as a Jewish state and doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. And it leads, or there is different things that's happening that leads to conflict, which again, we're not for the conflict. We think that at the end of the day we need to resolve the conflict, and the only way to do that is actually sit down and talk about the hard things, talk about the issue of the settlements in one way, talk about the issue of what will be the borders at the end of the day for a Palestinian state. There is over 85% of the Israeli Jews that are for two-state solution based on the 67 border line. So,
and I mean certainly the wider context of that issue needs to be addressed. But within that, I mean, what I've seen the perceptions is that. I mean, the part of the drive between the more recent, Israeli, in terms of strikes or retaliatory strikes, in terms of was, in part was internal political pressures by Netanyahu government, shaped in part by the coalition that's had since 2009, in part by the impact of upcoming Israeli elections, in part the fact that they followed almost immediately after U.S. national elections, which has been seen as driving driving what Netanyahu was doing, or perhaps attempting to do to reshift it. I mean, since I think that, none of these policies done on either side of it become inevitable or driven, I think, only by nationalist aims. I mean, it seems that there's always internal factions. There's always other kinds of pressures and perhaps ambitions being framed. So, it seems this is a fair characterization that understanding in terms of Netanyahu and his cabinet for.
Well, I'm sure. I want to say that on one hand, of course, you're absolutely right. There's no question about it that all decisions that politicians are making, unfortunately, I would say wouldn't be, but I think that in every country and every politician, they also look strategically about the time of other elections, like you said, internal issues, internal affairs, thinking about their own progress in the political system. What will they gain? What will they lose? Absolutely, you're right about it. But still, this operation came after a massive increase of attacks from the Gaza Strip on Israel, and the operation had really clear purposes, like finding tunnels that are being used to smuggle weapons from different places towards Gaza that is after that used against Israel. I also want to say that the attacks were very, very precise to that amount that unlike the missiles that are coming from Gaza to Israel, they're just aimed to kill civilians. The attacks from Israel on Gaza Strip or on target places where we know that missiles are being launched from there. True that a lot of citizens were hurt, but that was after Israel did a lot of took a lot of steps in order to prevent as many as possible of civilian casualties. For example, millions of leaflets were spread from the sky through helicopters to warn civilians not to be in a date and time and specific place. The people of Gaza also got a lot of text messages. There were pirate radios that warned people not to be in those specific places because Israel will bomb them. So,
but you have statements by cabinet ministers of aiming to send Gaza back to Stone Age. You have, you have different campaign that is hitting in terms of whether something or not, specifically parts for infrastructure inside Gaza setup of it. I know I've seen in terms of the IDF maintained blog as well, in terms where there are, similar justifications for attempts to minimize civilian casualties, but you're, I guess you're persuaded by that explanation? Or?
I would say, when you have when you are in a fight situation, you are fighting, and then I think that every sovereign state have the right to defend itself. That's what Israel do now, and when you fight, you have, I mean, people are being hurt. So that, I think that's part of that. The other thing is, as was mentioned, and I think that you said something about that, but the day after, or a few days ago, Khaled Mashal, who is the head of the Fatah war in Gaza, and visited them, and then he said, we will continue fights until Israel would no longer be there. So I think, again, I'm not, I would admit that there are things that we should and could do better. Again, there is, when it comes to moral issue, when you're in a state of war, there are issues. I mean, there are some casualties that you don't want to have. But at the same time, when you have a terrorist attack bombing a bus in Tel Aviv and having people killed in the center of Tel Aviv, think about what happened if it would happen here. Think about what happened if every day you'll have 3 rockets coming from your neighborhood, from your neighbor states, attacking you.
I mean, framing it as a national security issue, which presupposes it as a nationalist issue, which also, I guess, also assumes that, that these, that the violence and and casualties Israel suffer, in terms of, or require a kind of inevitable response. But there's some kinds of, different levels of violence and threat are provoked different ways. In 2011, I believe statistics indicate that 11 Israeli civilians died because of Palestinian violence, as recorded. At the same over the same year, 384 Israelis died in traffic accidents. The mere fact of death. Israelis die from organized crime, from reckless behavior, from alcohol consumption, from drug use. Certainly, you can say that at abstract philosophical level, any death is deplorable, but this, as a political issue, some deaths seem to be mobilized for and mobilized against in specific ways. And if framing the issue as the question of what are the necessary but perhaps regrettable acts that the legitimate state has taken to defend itself against terrorists, we've already answered the question at that point. We've already presumed that any degree of violence that might mete out is being defined as retaliatory, and being defined as responsive, and being defined as a wholly different category of it than what we call terrorist violence. If we're breaking down even down from definitions, it's both. It's terrorist violence on both sides. Is it not? If it's violence that it impacts and it is designed to intimidate and discourage others, or to create a condition of terror. One of them is backed by heavier weaponry, and the IDF has fundamentally more guns and weapons of it. But I just don't see why that makes it a fundamentally different category.
You want to tell me? I want to enter to your beginning of your statement. You're saying that because people are also. Let's take Israel out of the equation. Let's suppose we're talking about the United States of America. Then here also a lot of people are being killed in car accidents, and of course the way to fight it is a totally different kind of way than fighting if the World Trade Center is being blown away by terrorists. Of course, Israel is fighting car accidents by educating and by putting more policemen on the road, or doing whatever it can to prevent. The death from that kind of perspective. But when you are fought, but this is a different kind of casualties and of people being killed, so it's being addressed differently. When Israel is being attacked by bombs, by people that are launching those rockets toward Israel, unfortunately, one of the ways, and it's not the only way Israel is doing, because Israel is trying to do a lot of programs to promote peace between the Palestinians. Like Roy said, we need a partner on this. And when you have a partner that says that he doesn't recognize your right to exist, then the task is much more difficult.
And I want to add, I mean, in my previous position before I came here, what I did, I directed a dialogue program between Israeli Jews and Arabs. And the idea of that dialogue was coming from a perspective that, at the end of the day, you need to sit down around the table. You need to create some kind of an environment that will allow you to speak about your different circles of identities, whether it's your personal, when we have the similarities and when we have the differences, and how do we be able to balance and to respect one another within understanding there is differences. That would be, and again, we can always go back to, trying to do the aftermath of who is killing more and who is doing more harm to the other side. I think that we're in a certain situation that we need to understand two things. One is the narrative of each side and the psychology of each side. And we tend to picture Israel as the strong side in that war. Whereas for us as Israelis, and again, maybe it's a very subjective perspective, but for us as Israelis, we're surrounded by 23 Arab states. We are
hundreds of millions of Muslims in comparison to less than 7 million Jews in the Middle East.
But actually, I disagree with that standpoint that it's, that who's, in terms of suffering more, who's dying more, since, that's kind of the thing where most striking, obvious contrast if anything's putting for Israeli and Palestinian populations. Palestinian populations are dying more, Palestinian civilians are dying more, in terms of, but then from the brother standpoint, question of who is more threatened. The side that, doesn't have regional military dominance, the side that isn't receiving $2 billion in military support yearly, and the standpoint of Israel, if you take the broader standpoint, that in terms of that is 26 Arab states, presumes that 26 Arab states are united, are monolithic, are the same in culture, internal political structure, in terms of leadership, which is not correct. Describing as there's distinctions between individuals and groups of Jews, between individuals and groups of Muslims, and taking that sort of kind of Manichaean spectrum of it seems like it puts at the most paranoid, the most entrenched fortress. And certainly there are internal distinctions among different ones of Israel's neighbors that would be relevant. True?
I missed the last part.
The many Arab states, only one Jewish state, therefore Jewish state is the underdog, only makes sense as a system if assume that all surrounding areas of it are essentially similar and essentially united, which I think a lot of
even if not all of them are united and on the same kind of page or talking to each other, you can't ignore big players in that game. For example, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, a lot of countries that are surrounded by Israel that are very strong. Iran, we know, is a strong country. You're talking about the $2 billion that are coming from America to Israel, but you're not talking about the monies coming from America to Egypt that being smuggled into the Gaza Strip, and from Iran that's being smuggled into the Gaza Strip. There are much stronger.
U.S. is a stronger military backer than Iran is. Israel is a wealthier country. It is, more heavily militarized per proportion by virtue of having military service. I guess I don't understand the. It seems the dynamic of which Israelis are the tangible logistical underdogs.
Again, when I started saying that, I said it might be subjective, and again, you can go back and say that the way you perceive that. In every equation that you'll do, Israel will be stronger, or it's not the right way to perceive it. But I'm saying that if we actually think about the psychology of the Jewish people of Israel, and the fact that we had a Holocaust 60 years ago, and you had a place in Europe that tried to
extent
all the Jewish people on earth. And again, I know that it's one of the narratives that we are telling ourselves, and maybe it's not relevant to what's happening now, but for us as Jewish people, for us as Israel, that were built in many ways because of that. I mean, it's a big part of our national identity.
Certainly, but I mean, also, I mean, the fact that in terms of Palestinian communities and broader Arab nations had nothing to do with Holocaust makes it, even if it's a motivation, it can't be
it's not motivation. It's not about getting back, and it's not about getting back. God forbid. This is not Israel's perspective, not Israel's way. And when you're talking about measures and about how many are more dying, then I think it's a really hard comparison, because if they sent 15,000 rockets and only half of them hit and actually injured, and we send one rocket, and the purpose of this rocket is to stop another rocket, and there are five people from the Hamas surrounded that rocket, and then they die during that attack, then I mean, I'm not going to apologize because we're more precise and because we want to protect ourselves.
Well, I mean, but what seems even beyond the level of the military conflict, I mean, comparing the rate of the economic size, integration with the broader world, as compared with the level of unemployment and near economic collapse in Gaza. I mean, materially, day-to-day positions of it, Palestinians are living worse. The most, in terms of peaceful, non-militant, in terms of pro-Zionist, Palestinian in the Gaza and West Bank will still, in terms of wake up to a level of structural disadvantage and, fear of violence. I mean, it seems that questions of Israel as being the underdog seem to overly abstract it from situations of material life and day-to-day situations. And several points have made the sort of claim that, in terms of in some cases something only makes sense from the perspective of Jews or as Israelis. I mean, but it's not even like Israel is monolithic or united in that viewpoint. I mean, there are there are segments of the population that are opposed to Netanyahu's current policies. There are ones that are opposed to the expansion of settlements, that are opposed to Israel's presence beyond the Green Line from 67 borders. I mean, what would be counter towards, Gush Shalom, Anarchists Against the Wall, Kavias, Shora, New Profile, Bati Shalom, Tayash. The fact that there's...
Of course, it's a democracy. We have a lot of opinions and a lot of opinions and a lot of parties, different kind of views. Absolutely, this is democracy, and Israel is a successful state. Absolutely.
Well, and I think we'll return to that question, the point of it. But even the fact, you've sort of claimed that it's sort of that's inevitable, or that it's the position of being Israeli that causes to view these sort of policies. I mean, the fact that there are Israelis that would disagree with the statements you're making predominantly. What's the justification for having to?
And as I mentioned before, in my previous position, I directed a dialogue program, and dialogue program because I believe that at the end of the day, in order to move forward, we have to sit down and talk. We have to understand the other side. We have to understand that there are something that we will gonna agree upon and something that we will. But if you want to create some kind of a shared community, if you want to create some, to create neighborhood or live one next to the other, we have to understand the other side. This is why at the end of the day, when again we're doing the aftermath of who is killing more, and yes, each side have narrative. We have to understand that each side have some just to its demands. I think that, and that's, again, when I'm looking at Israel, I think what Israel is asking now is to be recognized as a Jewish state, to be recognized as a state that is not, that when the Palestinians will get their own state based on the 67 border. And I think that's in almost all the parties, running now for the next election. All of them are talking about going back to the 67 borders. But there is some, security issues going along with that, and there are some. But at the end of the day, we have to sit down and talk. Sending more rockets on either side, won't help either side. But for that, we need to have partners. Not just, I would criticize my government as well. I think that Bibi, at the UN should have said, yes, I'm for a Palestinian state. I'm for a Palestinian state, but at the same time, they need to recognize us as a Jewish state, and we need to work about security. But I think that if he would have done it a little bit more, a little bit smarter, he would have said, yes, I am for Palestinian state because 85% of the Israelis are for Palestinian state.
Well, but it's still, I think the part of argument, which I think this often does, seem to bring up, is the notion that Israel's actions, or in terms of defensive policies, become more legitimate because they are seeking dialogue, and they are essentially tolerant of Palestinian existence. But if we're taking from the quotes of leaderships involved, there's a strong legacy among Jewish population to regard Palestinian inhabitants as as a inconvenience to be. They're not tolerated. Theodore Herzl's A Land Without a People for a People Without a Land, Golda Meir's denial of the Palestinians as a legitimate recognized people. It seems that in either case could cherry pick a degree of acceptance or inclusivity, but there are also, to what extent that impacts on the policies of border police or day-to-day operations of IDF, or the things, not even Netanyahu, but Avigdor Lieberman and his recent rise to prominence, in terms of with requirement for wanting to introduce the need for loyalty oaths by Israeli Arabs towards steering for a Jewish and democratic state. Aren't those the things that are effectively problematic, that deserve to be called out on, and not sort of wrapped around the flag of Israeli national security?
I won't be the one to support, asking every citizens in Israel to, pledge for the Israeli flag. No, because you want to have, in a democracy, you want to allow people to speak up and say what are on their mind, within, of course, certain borders, that they don't hurt other people. But I think that, we all nation states nowadays, kind of struggling, and Israel is no different in that sense from most of the states in Europe, most of the countries in Europe. We try to create a monolithic culture in a geographical place. And just within times, we started to understand that there are more. It's not just one nation state, but you have a dominant nation in a state, and then there are some minorities. And then you need to see how, as a democracy or as a regime, you work with those minorities. And I think in that sense, we might need to distinguish between the Palestinian Arabs, citizens of Israel, and those lives in the West Bank and in Gaza, because again, it's a different legal term. Not that they don't deserve the right, to be treated as human being and get the rights that they need. But I'm saying that it's kind of, we are isolating Israel as a state, but in many cases, the things that we're facing is things that other states are facing. Other states are struggling with how to deal with minorities.
Well,
I want to also add just a second about what you said before about Israelis' expressions or statements towards Palestinians, and of course there has been a statement like that in the past, but at the end of the day, every time there was a negotiation, every time there was a peace process, Israel was always the one to say yes and to sit down to the tables. You can read Bill Clinton's book. You can read Condoleezza Rice's books. They're all saying that the people that blew up the negotiation the last minute were always the Palestinians, not recognizing and not willing to negotiate and to compromise. And Israel is, at the end of the day.
I guess I would dispute that interpretation. I mean, or more precisely, would distinguish between willingness to engage in some level of dialogue and willingness to shift the reality. I mean, to shift some of the direct material realities that are involved.
I mean, even Benjamin
with this.
Netanyahu, if you heard his last speech, it's called the Bar Ilan speech, is advocating for 2 states for 2 people.
But I mean,
I didn't hear Khaled Mashal talks about it.
I mean, talk of withdrawal to the green line of it doesn't go hand in hand with expansion of settlements. With the fact that the way that have been.
And I agree, and I think that this kind of move was, like you said, it was totally political. It was, in my opinion, very. I don't want to say stupid, but I don't understand the point of it. I think he didn't.
It's politics of symbols in a way,
Right.
because I think that, and I'm not saying that to kind of back up Netanyahu, but when he felt that the Palestinians are doing like a unilateral move at the UN, so he said, I'm going to do my unilateral move, but it's because the symbol, because for the Palestinians, the fact that they are now recognized as a state or it doesn't really change much on ground but I would say that again, I think that at the end of the day, both most people recognize the fact that when you have a peace agreement, Israel will evacuate most of the, other than the big settlements, they will evacuate all the smaller ones, and they'll have some land exchange. I do agree that it's a problem at this point, but I don't think that should be the one thing that will. This is why we don't have peace.
Well, I mean, partly if we're talking about Israel, like any society isn't a politically rigid or politically stable. I mean, it's subject to fluid flux and change in dimensions. I mean, one of the things that seems the most clear process. I mean, I think Gershon Dershowitz, on Making of Israel, I mean, has argued that the long-term tendency of occupation of Israeli presence, military and settlement, inside West Bank, is to promote. I mean, there's direct economic incentives for settlers and communities to form, which tend to give a host to a degree of right and far right ideals, tend to be fairly internally homogenous, xenophobically inclined segments. I mean, in terms of degrees understanding, and which themselves form voting blocs which are able to lobby and push very strongly for increased settlement, for increased militancy, for military support of existing settlements.
Yeah, but what you're saying is not. I mean, look at the history of the peace process and about the history of Israel. It's not. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but when the government of Israel decided to evacuate,
even Gaza,
to evacuate
settlements,
they did it. Although there are right-wing people in Israel, so what? They did it from Sinai. They did it from Gaza Strip. In case that there will be a peace process, hopefully there will be a peace process, and there will be evacuation of settlements from the West Bank. Then, although a lot of people wouldn't want to leave, I'm guessing that it's very natural and very understandable that people would not want to leave their land that they feel that belongs to their ancestors, fathers from 4,000 years ago. They do it. We do it. Look at the history. We did it time after time, and we will do it again. And I have no doubt about it.
I don't know, I guess I'm familiar. With the Gaza evacuation. As I said, it's because this is not sort of that segment of inevitability, but because of that, it's already would involve a much larger scale that would impact more people, that would impact more groups that have, somebody sort of more entrenched and more developed of it.
So it will take longer, probably, and people will be more upset. But even then, the fact is, they did.
But the assumption that would be happened, or would be a sort of small roadblock, that if in terms of if Palestinians were ever serious about peace, it seems that it's it's presupposing a lot of major shifts that would be able to be internally controlled in a direct way. And I guess I wanted to, but off that, talking more about earlier point, in terms of this standpoint of like Israel's similarity to other nations, which in many ways it is, but the situation of Gaza and the West Bank, particularly since the number of people involved, does seem distinct from other areas of the world. That there's, both, the extent of the population, which, as said before, is a large legal distinction between Israeli Arabs, who can and do participate in the political system, and Palestinians of the West Bank who cannot.
They can participate in their own political system.
No, but they are governed by, in terms of security checkpoints in Israeli military law, and do not have ability for legal recourse that's recognized.
I think that Israel, sorry.
I just point out that makes a distinct situation. This usual debate of like, is Israel criticized, too much, or sort of unfairly or harshly? But because of the demographic facts involved, there are unique aspects of the situation with Gaza and West Bank territories. I guess where do you see another country where there's as close similarities or like common elements in that?
I don't know, again, if there are other states with similarities. Any state of war over a long time is not a good one, and I think that Israel needs to find a solution, not just because of they need to find a solution for the Palestinian people. They need to find a solution because it would create a better state of Israel that you'll have, it will create. I don't think that controlling another people, putting us, it's not just about the world, and it's not just about the perception that we are perceived in the world, but we're putting our own children in a situation then that you don't want 18 years old people to stand in a checkpoint and being either bound or checking other people and controlling other people, because it's not a healthy solution. And again, I would say that the only way to solve that is to sit down and talk and find a solution, which will include, of course, other players. It's not just the Palestinian Authority and Israel. You will have to have, of course, the United States will be involved, and the European states, as well as probably some of the Arab states like Egypt, and that would be one part of the question. I think that the other part is, at the same time, now what you have in Syria, for example, in the last year and a half, you have, I think, over 50,000 people died in Syria in the last year and a half, which is more than what you have killing and dying in the Middle East, in both Palestine, Israel, in the last 40 years. But still, the focus of the world is not on what's happening in Syria. And again, if you want to do the simple math of how do we save more people, it will go there.
Well, the Syrian government isn't receiving military support from U.S. Israel is. It's not. It's not.
Is it okay that what's going on there that nobody?
It's less than. In terms of questioning, in terms of like why or degree of criticism. In terms of a American newspaper, or American college group that wants to give in a protest, can denounce Assad's regime. He's not going to see it. It's not, that act in itself doesn't influence it. A boycott zero of it does not affect meaningful change. It's that there are atrocities and human rights abuses that happening globally. But because Israel is regarded as a strong Western ally, as a democratic state in the Middle East, because it is tied to the U.S. in a large amount of ways, because a portion of tax revenue goes towards funding and arming them. that does tie them more directly.
Maybe, but I would also ask myself, why is for so many years the U.S. government continue to support Israel? And it's not just because of AIPAC. It's not just because that we have a strong Jewish lobby or Jewish population in America. It's partially because it's in the interest of America to have a democratic state in the Middle East. And
you keep, I guess, using that word of it, and I guess that comes back to, some of the basic question. Since if we sort of, accept that sort of standpoint that, that democracy is, desirable and that Israel is the only democratic state, then, from there to, make more exceptions or allowances for, towards their behavior that would otherwise provide. Sorry. I'll keep that temporarily. But the question, in terms of what partly by a standpoint of, I said it before, that Israel exists to be a Jewish state, which means in practice to be a racially defined state. That it's not. It's not theocratic. It's not defining Jewish based on condition of faith or dogma or religious ritual. It's basing it on, in terms of Judaism and Jews as a ethnic group that are prioritized, that have the capability, the ease for, in terms of American Jewish population, to immigrate into Israel. Disfavors on ethnic grounds.
But let's admit that in every state, even if it's America, the big America of the United States, you have a majority, and in here it's the majority will be a Christian, white, male, that probably dominate the culture. If you go to England, the Queen of England is the head of the church. The flag of England is a cross that symbolizes Christianity. Many countries in Europe have cross on their flag because they are Christian flag. But I also want to say one more thing.
Just to clarify, so you think that every state, every nation has the right to define a internal dominant standard that is privileged?
I'm saying it even if they don't. Almost every nation, there's only two nations that they don't have one dominant ethnicity, which is Portugal and Japan. The rest, you do have some kind of ethnicity. So it might not be based on religious, but it will be based on color. If you talk about America, it can be based on religious in other states. And in Israel, again, it's not. But what I want to say, I think the difference between Israel and other states is that there is no separation between church and state in that matter. But it doesn't mean that it's all Jewish culture. It means that in schools, yes, you have the Jewish schools, but you also have the Muslim schools and you have the Christian schools. It means that the rabbis are being funded by the government, but it also means that the imams are being funded by the government, and it means that the priests are being funded by the government. So
separate and equal?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look at budgets. I don't know where you're basing your assumptions that Christians or other minorities. Of course, they're minorities, so they have in the budget they have a much less portion of it, but it is equal to their numbers. Absolutely. I also want to say a few more things because you said before about the uniqueness of the conflict. Of course, it's unique, but every conflict is unique. I'm sure that if you'll ask the Irish people, and they'll say that their conflict is unique in other ways, and the conflicts that are happening in Africa are unique in their own ways. I think that what is common to all those conflicts, to every conflict that are long and persistent, is that something in the collective memory, in the history, in the perspective and the narrative should be is so immigrated inside the society that it influences a lot of the abilities of both sides to negotiate and to talk. And the other thing I wanted to say about a Jewish state is that, again, looking at the history of the Jewish people that have been survived for the last, a little bit more than 2,000 years, genocide after genocide, yes, we definitely want a Jewish country. You may call it racism from your perspective. I call it a very deep need and justified need to have a state that when we might or or hopefully not be genocide again, we'll have a place to go to.
But
well, I mean, if ethical standpoint means anything, it means that you, an individual or group that has suffered is not justified on taking out suffering on third parties.
Absolutely.
But that's intrinsically what if you're pushing to the
I'm saying that this is a reason to the justification of having Israel as a Jewish state.
But if you're pushing towards the background of genocide that in terms of Jewish population has suffered, that doesn't. That's not a good ethical standpoint for why a state that privileges Jewish population and Jewish ethnicity. I mean, against it, but the other question on like deep democratic.
I disagree,
From standpoint. I mean, I agree to some extent. All nation states do do privilege dominant groups and certain types of people based on class, based on race. But to that extent, all nation states are illegitimate or are invalid as they.
So you're saying just Israel is illegitimate?
No, I'm saying no. Also, I think all states are illegitimate, but any given standpoint doesn't. And the fact that there are other cases of it that exist and they're problematic doesn't justify problematic things that might be in a particular example that are going to. But even the part of question of like standpoint of democracy, since Michael had said before, it listed a number of Israeli groups that were just defined variously as pro-peace in terms of anti-occupation, and had mentioned that as the strength, the fact that it existed and had diversity of viewpoint. I mean, certainly if democracy means anything, it means in terms of the diversity of views that are not in terms of crushed or coerced, that citizens have a variety of perspectives at which they can decide on and influence in terms of their political involvement, so that in some way even the fact that there are that in terms of anti-occupation Jews living inside Israel becomes a argument for the credibility of Israel.
But
true. Sorry, it's a bit of
I'm saying it proved that Israel tolerates a lot of voices inside of it, absolutely.
But tolerate in a sense. I mean, the ones that had mentioned. I mean, all the Muslims have done have been harassed fairly consistently. Over half of.
Oh, that's not true. That's not true. And they were leading the government at some point. At some points, they were not leading the government.
But also,
we have 3 members of the Knesset. I want to see 3 members of the American Parliament that met Hezbollah and that have been participating in actions against the state of Israel, and they're still members of the Knesset, member of the parliament, the Israeli parliament. I think it shows that Israel is a democracy.
I'm not even even talking about Palestinian in terms of individuals or in terms of groups in the standpoint of it, but even looking at the legacy and the current conditions of Jewish groups, of Israeli groups inside Israel that are critical of the basis of military policy in the a new profile that, in terms of, had a large portion of its membership in prison for encouraging refusal of military service in, both in the West Bank and more broadly. Anarchists Against the Wall had Lamar Goldstein, 2006, shot in the head with a rubber bullet around a thing of lead from 15 feet away during peaceful demonstration.
And you have people from the right wing of the map that are also sitting in jails and prison. And you have right people that are sitting in civilian custody without even knowing why are they sitting, because there is intelligence and information about them. They might harm Palestinian civilians.
But the standpoint is that if you wish to be a peaceful demonstrator, Israel is not the country to be it.
It's not
true.
It's not true.
Based on you would deny that. The incidents of in terms of police and IDF forceful suppression.
But what happened to Wall Street? Last year. it's again, it's very easy to say that Israel is, it's not the place to demonstrate, but you had the same issues here when you have extremists demonstrating at Wall Street. So that was riots, and and the police came and they were violence against them, and they made some violence way to stop them. But I'm not sure if that's I'm not sure if that's again. I know that
characterizing Wall Street as a riot is again the side point. I mean, again the fact that police authority and police suppression exists in many countries. Certainly, United States heavily among them. I mean,
it doesn't mean that that's the way it should be. And again, it doesn't mean that but it also doesn't mean that when you take an individual event, you can generalize because of that. I think that if you look at the Israeli NGO and like the social sphere in Israel, and you see the amount of cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian groups, and you see the amount of voices that being able to be raised. So yes, I mean, if you want to be if you want to take a few events that happens and from that
or even a large number of events. I mean, a large number of cases of Israeli soldiers that even when using lethal violence against civilians are not generally dismissed from position.
But where do you base your information off? I mean, again,
I don't know where were you reading this information? I mean, have you ever been to a quiet demonstration in Israel that has been shut down? I was, or he was. We were there. We can tell you that it's not true. That
but also, if you have statistics,
hundreds of people are demonstrating, peaceful demonstrations, and they're not being arrested. And there are a lot of soldiers that are sitting in jail if they did something wrong because they're being investigated. There are. I don't know where you're basing your facts on.
I mean,
you read it at Al Jazeera, or I don't know.
I mean, video statistics done by B'Tselem, victims of
we are monitored by the UN. We're monitored by Amnesty.
I mean, the fact that IDF has significantly more permissive rules of engagement for use of violence and shooting of tear gas, shooting of rubber bullets than most UN conventions recognize. I mean, and then claiming that it's only a matter of individual incident seems to, I think, willfully ignore, the structures that enable us. I mean,
there's again, we're kind of getting ourselves into the loop that it's not. I mean, you're bringing kind of a statement that is not based on any statistic, anything. So again, it's your word against ours. So there's no point in doing that. The question is, and I'm going back to what do we want to have? I think yes, it's important to understand the history, the sociology, and the psychology of the conflict. But do we actually only want to kind of point out they are bad because of that, we're bad because of that, or trying to kind of create an understanding, create some kind of a trust? There is something very frustrating, even if you are here and we can't create a conversation and a dialogue, understanding that there are two people, you can say that one is suffer more, the other, but two people at the end of the day, how do we allow them and us and all of us create a better place, and not just going and saying, this is bad and this is worse and this is good, and I don't understand where you're taking this.
A basic standpoint is that there are much of the violence and the coercion and arrests and intimidation that happen, both against Palestinian communities as well as against elements of Israeli community that go too far against the political mainstream, that go too far against the
But
policies of occupation.
But are you also willing to say anything about how the Palestinians are acting? Are you also willing to say that, that the fact that the Palestinian, the government they have in Gaza, the Hamas government that not recognize Israel as a Jewish state, they are not willing to sit down and talk. Are you willing to, that are bombing, they have terror attacks that killing innocent citizens, Israeli citizens. It's not that it means that what Israel is doing is right, but are you willing to condemn that?
No, my standpoint, that violence is done, whether that's done by, it's done by Palestinians against Israelis, and also by Palestinians against other Palestinians, as as with recent Hamas-Fatah internal fighting has involved, in terms of deplorable, deeply repressive, deeply destructive acts that all people of good conscience should, should find appalling and illegitimate. But if there has to be a a hierarchy or a range of standpoints, I consider it own ethical obligation, and in connection with my standpoint of Jewish legacy and the moral obligation to have to make at least justifications for the people with the most amount of power, with the most amount of wealth, to sympathize with the people living in poverty that are dying and being incarcerated in much greater numbers, to side ultimately with the oppressed rather than those who are in a more dominant position. So I'm sorry to cut off of it, but I think we're close to the end of time and want to provide the next views. And as a final note for in order to bring beyond in terms of simply Israel conflict of it, I would remind regular listeners that in terms of in Milwaukee marches for justice for Derek Williams continues. Recently today there was a gain by Richard Shonin being refired by the Police and Fire Commission reversing decision. Would encourage interested parties living in and beyond River West area to come this Friday at 3 o'clock to 6 in Wisconsin to continue with Occupy the Hood and support for social justice and opposition to police brutality. Thank you very much. Thanks again to the guests, and good night.